start. We are recording today, as Jolene will explain in a few moments here. Good afternoon again. My name is Ingrid Anderson. I am the National Policy Director at MIWSAC, the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. I have been with MIWSAC since May of last year, so coming up on my 1-year anniversary. And I've been excited to step into the role of policy director, knowing that policy work has been being done by most of our staff since MIWSAC's beginning. And I know a lot of folks associate our executive director and some of our longer term employees with that work. And I'm hoping that based off of our time together today, the rest of you will feel encouraged and inspired to start some of your own policy advocacy work. You're all doing it already in the ways that you speak about your work, the way that you engage your community, the way that you advocate for your community and for survivors of sexual violence. And hopefully we'll kickstart a conversation about supporting you and about expanding your work in the future. I'm going to pass it now to my colleague, Jolene Engelking, to introduce herself.
Bonjour and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jolene Engelking. I am a White Earth Anishinaabe from Minnesota. I work alongside Ingrid in our National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center, which is a wonderful and exciting project that has been allowing us to reach out and work in more and more communities across the country to really explore what do survivors of sexual violence need and how can we work with programs who are both responding and working in prevention to really feel supported and feel confident in meeting the distinct needs of sexual violence survivors. And so today I will be taking a bit of a back seat. I will be here for the folks who are on live as the background tech person. So please feel free to chat things in to me, including questions and all of that. We also have two wonderful ASL interpreters with us today, Sarika and Maria. And so thank you both for being on. And so I will be here and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, Maria and Sarika. We are so excited to have you all with us today. Because we're a smaller group, I am hoping that we will be able to converse, engage with each other as we talk about policy advocacy. So as Jolene mentioned, please feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat. We are also recording this, so hopefully it can be shared out and be a resource for you all in the future. So just as we kind of come together, I'd like to posit a couple questions. I always find it helpful, especially as I'm thinking about, what we're advocating for, talking or thinking about, macro policy and what that looks like in our communities. I find myself gravitating towards questions that keep me very grounded and connected to my purpose. We, as Native people, are, connected. We need to feel that connection. We need to restore that connection between ourselves, between ourselves and the land, and to help us understand and feel our position in the larger picture of things. So 2 questions I'd like to ask you today. Feel free to drop your answer in the chat or just contemplate these for yourself. What are you emerging through? Maybe you're feeling like you've been in the thick of things for a while. Maybe you've been feeling the weight of the work. Maybe today, on the first day of spring, you're feeling like there's a rebirth, there's a renewal. Maybe you're feeling some energy, some excitement about growth, about expansion. Maybe you're not feeling quite like you've emerged, but you're emerging. And as part of that, what is feeling hopeful for you right now? A couple of things I'll share. I have just been so excited to think about the return of land to the original peoples in Minnesota, return of land to the Dakota, and just been thinking about what it might look like to expand policy and understanding of what it really looks like to return land to the original peoples of Turtle Island. And I'm hopeful that this will start maybe a cascade of other states, maybe even the federal government, considering land back. And how am I stewarding my connection to the land and my homelands? So as we're thinking about that, we can also think about the tenacity of Indigenous people. We're still here, right? We're resilient by virtue of our existence. And what does it look like to advocate for policy that reflects our resilience and that expands our resilience and supports our resilience? I love this statement by Wilma Mankiller. The secret of our success is that we never, never give up. And so I'm encouraging you all today to carry that, maybe that kind of credo with you as you're thinking about your work, you're thinking about perhaps expanding your engagement with policymakers, perhaps dedicating some resources within your own organization, or exploring some collaborative opportunities, perhaps with MIWSAC, with me, or other coalitions that possibly you could invest in to help you keep on going. So let's start with some shared definitions so that we're all on the same page as we have this conversation today. So there are a lot of words that get thrown around that really are the words of the colonizer, right? These are words developed by federal agencies, the federal government. And so one of our shared assumptions maybe that we can enter into today is an understanding that we define things differently for our own selves, for our own nations, our own tribes, our own communities, and we can share an understanding of language that is used by the federal government and by these other layers of government with whom we are obligated to interact. So if you have any questions or concerns, or if a word is very activating for you, I encourage you to share that. And I would welcome a conversation. I think language matters. And so I would like to be in conversation with you all about that today. So we'll start with a conversation about legislative advocacy. So when we're thinking about advocating for legislation, maybe for or against, maybe it's legislation in your state government. Maybe it is, a policy that the federal government is trying to adopt that would affect, for example, the Department of the Interior, which would then affect tribes. There's a process, of course, unique to each agency and specifically to each legislative body. So we're talking about working with individual lawmakers and the various lawmaking bodies to gain support for your cause or initiative, and usually for the needs of a specific population, for an organization or group of organizations, or for a specific purpose. So we can think about even say the development of like the tribal sexual assault coalitions. We can think about funding for IHS. We can think about increasing resources for tribal police and for maybe the FBI serving Indian country. All of those things are affected, directed by legislation. And so it can be helpful to think about legislation as a tool. It's one tool. Next, we'll talk about community-based advocacy. So not everybody is interested or feels like their role in the work is to engage with legislators or to perhaps be, at the Capitol building or to be writing letters to policymakers. But there are so many ways to engage in policy work. So when we're thinking about community-based advocacy, we can think about a strategic approach to influencing outcomes and really driving change or moving change forward on behalf of your community. So looking at your names here this morning, I would guess that you all are very familiar with community-based advocacy, and this is likely the bulk of your work, maybe how you would define your work. So it really is about representing your community's rights and needs to the level of government who is best able to respond. So sometimes we get kind of stuck in thinking about, the tribal, like government to government relationship with the federal government. But there are also, many other layers or levels of government. So if we're thinking about your tribal council, perhaps you're thinking about a school board, city council. Some of us are living on tribal lands, on reservations. Some of us are, part of the urban diaspora. Some of us have, our families were relocated and we're very far away from our homelands. And so it doesn't always have to be advocacy to a tribal agency. Can advocate for, example, expanding a curriculum in public school to include or enhance the discussion of Indigenous peoples. A couple months ago, we spoke with a woman whose tribal lands bordered or were part of within the city limits of an off-reservation city. And she was talking about what it looked like to engage with the city council, just around simple kind of administrative issues, normal city issues, right? City maintenance, city parks, all that type of thing. Next, we'll talk about systems-based advocacy. So when we're talking about systems-based advocacy, we're thinking about folks who are employed or maybe work within the larger systems that govern our society. So we can think about folks who are in the prosecutor's office. Maybe they're in tribal government, they're maybe in the military, and they're providing services to consumers, to the citizens, the folks who are engaging with their agency. And sometimes it can feel like, when we speak to people at these agencies, they're just going to toe the line. They're just going to do whatever their agency policy says to do. But we can also think about ways that those folks can be allies. We can be educating, we can be communicating with people in these positions in a way that helps move our cause forward. Maybe we're changing the language that is used when we engage with those offices Maybe we're asking for things that have never been asked for before. And that's really how change comes about, right? Is by being willing to ask for something different. So I'd like to talk about the role of government in general. I know, all of us have a baseline understanding here, but I do want to just take a pause to reflect. I think part of policy work is being very being introspective and aware of our own assumptions and our own relationship with the idea of government, with the idea of legislation, of having these, I don't want to say barriers, but having these different ways that we have to navigate systems that are often foreign or contradictory to our original ways of being and of understanding the world. So if we can just take a pause, and we can think about what really defines our relationship with government. So this might be personal to you. This might be something that you learned, in high school, or maybe we're thinking about the roll down maps in our elementary school classrooms, and that was our understanding of government. They establish borders, they enforce borders. Maybe we're thinking about the nature of the relationship between our tribe or our community with the state government or federal government. Maybe we're thinking about our own organization's funding sources. Are we funded through federal agencies? What does that relationship look like? Are we in positive relationship or healthy relationship with federal funders? Do we have MOUs, memoranda of understanding, with other government agencies? Pardon me, have a sip of water. With other government agencies or with other federally funded partners? Are we maybe in relationship with a city government and a tribal government who are perhaps not in good relationship with each other? We understand that these relationships are complicated sometimes, but our understanding of them and the way that we feel about them are essential to moving our policy work forward. So taking a moment to reflect on our understanding and then our feelings about our understanding can help kind of define the scope of your work and where you want to focus your energy. So as part of that, let's think about or reflect on an opportunity to adjust our relationship with governmental agencies, and to adjust our understanding of it. I can say that prior to coming to MIWSAC, I was the director of a victim witness assistance unit housed in a prosecutor's office. I worked at a child advocacy center, part of a multidisciplinary team with law enforcement and other investigatory agencies. And those relationships were essential to my work. That understanding of all those different relationships and navigating those relationships was essential for me to be able to do my day-to-day work. Now, coming to MIWSAC, I'm away from direct service. So that, of course, is changing my understanding of relationships with these agencies. I'm not talking about specific cases, right? When I'm speaking with other agencies, I'm more talking about the policies that impact our workflow. I'm talking about access to funding opportunities. How are we articulating the needs of Native communities in policies that are being passed at the federal level, for example. So in thinking about that, we can think about what skills we want to cultivate for ourselves as individuals. What skills do we want our organization to become proficient in? For example, grant writing. For example, writing like white papers, like a policy kind of review. And how do we want to adjust our understanding or our relationship with our community? So maybe you've had this experience. I've had this experience in several different points of my life where we can fall into a routine or a habit of feeling alienated or disenfranchised, kind of like that disconnect from our government. Maybe we don't feel like our elected officials represent our needs. Maybe we don't feel like what is being talked about within the federal government is reflecting, or I should say federal government, state government, whatever, is reflecting the most urgent and pressing needs of the communities, the community where I've lived or where I've served. And that those have served as opportunities for me to think about how can I uplift the needs of my community? How can I advocate for, say, greater funding for child advocacy centers across the state? How can I clarify my understanding of the Crime Victims Fund so that I can understand where this shortfall is coming from? So I just encourage everyone to take those moments of tension or confusion, or maybe just like that feeling of like disgust or repulsion with government, as an opportunity to adjust our thinking, to adjust our understanding, and then to identify an opportunity to move the work forward. And I hope that you all know that you are not alone in that, and that MIWSAC, myself and our team at MIWSAC, absolutely will support and help you move that work forward. And we'll talk about that in a few slides here. Are there any questions at this point? I'll just take a moment here. Okay. So moving ahead, we can talk about the role of policymakers. So sometimes we're just seeing folks who are elected. Maybe we just hear their name in the news. Maybe their platform is clear or unclear to us, but maybe there is that moment of disconnect. But overall, I'll speak broadly here today. The role of a policymaker is to consider a few things in either advocating for a policy, which might look like voting for it or bringing it to committee, that type of thing. Really starts with the question of, is this policy a good idea? So that's kind of an abstract question, but really, does it meet the needs of the stakeholders? So if someone is looking to pass a bill to, say, expand funding for subsidized lunches in public schools, it's essential to understand the needs of families who are accessing public schools. So that might look like doing a root cause analysis to determine, we think the problem is access to lunch while the children are at school, but maybe the root cause lies elsewhere. And so policymakers are going to be looking at that. They're also going to be asking the question that we're all so familiar with, right? Is how are we going to fund this idea? How are we going to fund this piece of legislation? And is that a good use of tax dollars? So I really don't enjoy thinking about taxes. I don't enjoy thinking about budgets and line items, that type of thing. But it is a good kind of understanding to have, or thought to have in the back of your mind, is, with this finite amount of money, is this a good use of these dollars? Is this going to say best serve our community? Is this an investment in the values that myself as an individual, my organization has espoused? And then, of course, do we have buy-in from other lawmakers? Lawmakers operate alone. They're working as coalitions. They're operating as sometimes just within their party, like within their Democrats, Republicans, that type of thing. And so what you might think is an impossible coalition, or it would be impossible to get bipartisan buy-in, sometimes we're surprised. I think often we're surprised. And bipartisan legislation is definitely more successful. And I always enjoy seeing the coalitions that are built and that become so powerful when we're able to connect legislation to values, right? So when we're talking about policy that we want to advocate for, perhaps as individuals or perhaps as an organization, it is essential to connect that to the values. And so that might encourage you to do a little bit of work as an organization or as a community to articulate those values, and to help organize your policy priorities then around those values. So in thinking about community-based advocacy, which I think is probably what most of us are doing every single day in the way that we live and work and just exist, it's important to think about those values and how we are bringing those values forward. So how are we developing our understanding of shared values within our community? Sometimes we know that we share values with our neighbors, perhaps just within our tribe, because these things have been articulated. Maybe we have values, painted on the walls in our schools, or maybe there's a plaque in our library or in these public shared spaces. But sometimes we need a little bit of support to gather that information in a way that allows us to articulate that to our policymakers. So I advocate for the tool of a survey to really make sure that we're understanding the voice, the needs, the messages that resonate with and best identify the needs of our community. And, part of what we as Indigenous people have experienced as part of colonization is the removal of access to our language and disconnect from our cultural values, through that process of colonization. And sometimes we use words, or we've adapted an understanding of the world that is colonized. And doing some survey work, whether formal or informal, can help us to reconnect with our traditional values and what we really want to invest in as we work toward maybe decolonizing our community's relationship with government, or with different funding sources, or maybe that's not the direction that your community is wanting to head in. But as you look to mobilize your community, to activate your community around certain issues, I think it really starts with surveying in some fashion to develop that shared understanding. And maybe that looks like a listening session. That word is used, or that phrase is used a lot these days, and it's because it's powerful to bring us together, to be in shared space with each other, to not only hear each other's words, but to be able to feel what folks are bringing to that space is so powerful. Like once you have felt perhaps the sadness or the pain or the frustration of your relatives, you can't unfeel that. And that can be a real source of power and activation, moving your policy work forward as maybe you're looking to determine your policy priorities as an organization or as a. So as we're doing these surveys, as maybe we're having these listening sessions, what we're looking for is a shared message. So what is a shared message that we can all rally around, that not only declares our values, declares our priorities, but is easy and accessible for legislators, for policymakers to hear and to remember. So a little plug here, we're co-hosting an action day in Minnesota in a couple of weeks here on April 3rd at the Capitol, about to hopefully advocate for expanding funding for victims and survivors of crime and their families. And so the messaging is invest in survivors. So the word invest, of course, relates to funding. We're asking for greater funding. And, survivors, we're talking about, all folks who identify as a survivor of crime. So it's, we're talking about children, we're talking about our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, we're talking about gun violence, we're talking about all these forms of victimization, but we're all rallying together around a shared message that's going to be accessible, easy for legislators and policymakers to remember and to understand. And we need to be considering, does that message really represent the needs of the community? So sometimes we can get distracted by rhetoric, right? We can hear maybe what the media is saying about an issue, or we can get really wrapped up in maybe what tribal council is talking about. And before we realize that maybe we're engaging in somebody else's policy priority, and we have lost the focus on our community, or we've developed a disconnect between what our community has asked us to advocate for and what our governmental agency or office has said that they will do. And so I think it's just important to continue to come back to community. What does our community need? What have they said that they need? What is this impact going to look like and really feel like? And part of that is just serving as an information pass-through. So how I would also like to, folks to take a moment to reflect on how are we best taking in information, and then how are we best passing that along? So, some of us, because we're federally funded, we hear things, we're in space with federal agencies, we're in communication with, representatives of the federal government, perhaps more frequently than our family members or maybe even our coworkers. And, how are we best sharing that information out? At the end of our time together here, we'll talk about some some really robust organizations serving Indian country who have heavily invested in passing along information and making information accessible, kind of, I would say, like democratizing access to information and serving as an advocate in that way, like making sure that we not only have access, but that we can have an understanding around the information that is shared out. So at this point, I'd like to talk about what it really looks like to take action on policy work within maybe within your organization or perhaps as an individual. I apologize that I don't know everybody's exact role or area of interest who's with us here today. But I believe that taking action begins with doing research. So when we're talking about advocating for, say, a piece of legislation, or we're advocating for, a change in regulation, how are we best able to frame our request in a way that resonates with policymakers? So I think it usually starts with gathering statistics or gathering information or data that can help folks understand the context of the issue. So, one comment that came out after the Not Invisible Act Commission did their listening sessions around the country was like that the issue of our missing and murdered relatives is bigger, broader than anyone could have understood. Now, we as Native people, we understood that. We have understood the vastness of this crisis for many years. But I think that what was difficult to communicate is the challenges, the context of the crisis that has posed so many challenges. So, like, how do we really explain what rural on a reservation looks like? This is rural to the next level, right? When I lived in, I'm originally from Minnesota. When I lived in Minnesota, I thought I lived in a rural community. I was about an hour from St. Paul. And now I live out west, and now I understand rural, having to drive 4-ish hours to an airport, having to do an overnight trip to do big grocery shopping trips. So that kind of context can really help our policymakers understand, why we need more funding, or why transportation isn't just an issue of getting a gas gift card. I believe that the Attorney General Merrick Garland traveled to Alaska to be in connection and community with some of our Alaska Native relatives. And after that trip, there was a comment made like, oh, after, the flights had to be canceled and the telecommunications went out because of a storm, and even military level aircraft could not transport us. Now we understand what it means to be a victim of crime and not have access to resources in Alaska. And I am so proud of folks in Alaska who helped the federal government develop that contextual understanding of the crises facing Native women there. I also encourage you then to use that research, that development of shared understandings, move that into developing your organizational, your internal policy priorities. So using that information that maybe you've gathered from your stakeholders, maybe from your board members, from the communities that you're serving, maybe, students that you're working with. Now, how do we kind of boil that down into our policy priorities? And then how do we declare those as an organization so that we know what we're going to say yes to, what funding opportunities we're going to get really excited about. So we know what events we're going to show up at. We're going to have a robust showing of, how are we going to activate people around these policy priorities? And they don't always have to be, these huge, overarching concepts that can be very abstract. These can be like a micro policy priority. It can be, say, accessing funding or fundraising to have access to snow removal equipment for the school. To have a safe environment. We're going to invest in these small things that are going to have a big impact on our community. Then we're going to present those priorities to our stakeholders. We're going to talk to our school board. We're going to talk to our boards of director. We're going to go back to our community, and we're going to say these are the priorities. And we're going to engage around that, have this conversation. Do these priorities represent, the conversations that we've had? Are we being good stewards of not only funding, but of the stories that you've entrusted us with? Are we in good relationship with our community enough to be able to receive that feedback? And maybe we need to make some adjustments. Maybe our stakeholders have shifted. Maybe our audience has grown. I think about MIWSAC even. We have, our coalition is Minnesota based, and we also are, serving communities across the country. So that has changed, that has grown, that has evolved. And we need to be able to adjust our priorities, to adjust our messaging accordingly. And what are, those easy ways for people to engage with you? Are you, maybe do you have like a contact us on your website? Are you engaging through Facebook? How are people able to give you that feedback in real time? Maybe without having to schedule another listening session, and kind of manage the logistics of that whole convening. But how are we able to stay in good communication with our communities? I think that is essential, to both be able to receive feedback and then to adjust our work accordingly. And sometimes we can't, right? Sometimes maybe we're restricted by our funding sources. Maybe we just don't have the staff or the capacity for whatever reason to respond to certain requests. But that feedback is really, I believe, essential to serving our communities and to advocating for policies that really represent the needs that folks have expressed to us. So as I mentioned earlier, we at MIWSAC care about your policy work. We care about uplifting the voices of Native folks who are, serving your community. You're doing the work. You are hearing the stories. You're sharing in these experiences with, survivors, with victims, with folks who are, maybe they're on day one of their survivorhood, and maybe they're in year 50 of their survivorhood. But we want to support your work as you support survivors. And as we work towards developing communities that are free from violence. So we'd like to talk about ways that we can support your policy efforts as an individual, as an organization, as a community. We do offer in-person support in we're able to come visit you to maybe do a site visit or to offer in-person trainings, whether that looks like developing a survey to share with perhaps your membership or your community, and whatever that scale might look like. We also do offer a specialized training and technical assistance. So if you have maybe a unique question or something that maybe you scoured resources for and you just can't find an answer, or can't find anybody who has a community that's just like yours, we value that. We value the unique beauty of our tribal communities, and we want to offer you training and technical assistance that meets the needs where you are. And we'd also like to talk with you about collaborative resource development. So, maybe you are just starting some policy work. Maybe you have you've observed a window of opportunity to have a voice, maybe within like your state, with your state legislators, or maybe with tribal council or at the federal level. And we'd like to talk with you about developing resources that can help your organization or your community get more involved, and to feel well supported, to feel well resourced in doing that work. I think sometimes we can see, this robust work that's being done on a national level by perhaps these organizations, and we're thinking, oh, how can we ever do that, or how can we get involved in that way? And we want to support your work. We want to uplift the voices of anyone who cares, of anyone who can use a little extra support or some additional resources, understanding that everybody's needs are a little bit different. And so we would like to be creative and responsive to your unique needs. Just like to direct folks to 3 organizations who I think represent the different ways we can do policy advocacy. We can do policy work in Indian country. First, we have our amazing friends, colleagues, partners at the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, MIWRC. They have a phenomenal team of researchers, of advocates, of folks who have been doing policy work for a long time. And they hold a lot of knowledge, they hold a lot of history, and they want to share it. They want to support the work that other folks are doing. They're really working towards social change through, the tools of legislative advocacy, staying grounded in grassroots and, the community-based work that so many of you are doing. We also have the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the several different convenings they host, really as that government to government relation with the federal government. They do, quite a bit of legislative advocacy around issues affecting tribes, and they also serve as they have a lot of phenomenal resources. So if you're wanting to look at the history, maybe of different policies, maybe what was the conversation around this issue when it first came up, or, even looking at the history of gaming, those types of things, they have a wonderful archive that is a great resource. And on that note, I forgot to mention that NIWRC also has a legislation tracker, which has served me in several different roles that I've had across the years to kind of get a feel for legislation that is being brought up at, in different states, maybe around our missing and murdered relatives, around sexual violence, access to housing, different resources like that. And it can help us see, which elected official or representative is working on these different bills, these different issues. Did it pass? How far did it get? And we can do a little research on how things went, so we can learn and refine our approach to this work as we continue on. And of course, we have the Native American Rights Fund, NARF, providing that legal advocacy, that systems-based advocacy, representation, and advocacy for tribes, tribal citizens, really representing so many of our needs in the legal system, thinking even about like water rights, and thinking about the movement to return land to tribes and to tribal stewardship. And we owe a great debt to NARF and their phenomenal team. And of course, there are so many other phenomenal organizations out there, but I encourage you to familiarize yourselves with at least these three to get a good understanding of the work that is being done, the different convenings, the ongoing conversations that Native-led organizations are having with the federal government and state governments, of course, as well. So in conclusion, I just want to thank you for your time, for your attendance. I did see that there was a question about sharing out the slides. This presentation has been recorded. The slides will be available. But my preference is that you reach out if you would like to talk a little bit more about this, if you have a direction that you'd like me to take and to do a little, we can present more trainings on issues relating to, policy advocacy, to policy work. We definitely are hoping that this is the start of some extensive policy training and support that we as MIWSAC would like to provide you all with. Of course, we are MIWSAC, the Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition, and Jolene Engelking and I are working under the National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center housed at MIWSAC. So I appreciate you all so much for being here today. Are there any questions? Anything that folks would like to share? Insight, experiences? Maybe folks have something that you've been kind of thinking about doing, or a letter you've been thinking about writing that you'd like to share out. I can tell you that we'll be very excited for you, and we'd like to cheer folks on however you decide to move the work forward. All right. Well, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our phenomenal ASL interpreters. We have so valued your help here today. And we will, of course, share out this recording on our platforms. So please engage, please sign up for our newsletter, and we look forward to being in conversation with you all in the future.